Right, good evening. Welcome to the Melbourne School of Engineering, the Melbourne Forum. So my name is Peter Lee. I'm from the Department of Biomedical Engineering at the University of Melbourne. So we go into the former event now. So I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which this event is taking place and the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay respects to their elders and families past and present. So we are here to hear about solving the mystery of the HL Hunley. Now this is a historical medical mystery for over 150 years. Now the Confederate States submarine, HL Hunley, was the first combat submarine to actually sink a warship. But it also disappeared, right, for about 150 years or something like that. And then, it was then found in 1995 right at the bottom of the harbor. Now, the question that people has been asking for a long time is, how did the crew of the submarine HL Hunley die? Now, the remains of the crew were found in all at the station. So these folks were all sitting in the station, and there was no obvious, attempt to escape, to escape out of the submarine. No evidence of injuries, traumatic type injuries to the head, to the skull, or the bones. So there are many hypotheses around this mystery, and of course there are many stories as well. So tonight, we really have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Deyo Bass to present his story of solving the mystery of the HL Hunley. So Dr. Bass has more than 20 years experience in blast biomechanics, computational modeling, soft tissue mechanics. So he's an internationally well-recognized expert. So he started his career as a postdoctorate fellow at the University of Virginia, having earned the prestigious National Science Foundation Fellowship. In Virginia, following that, after his postdoctorate fellowship, he started a program in military injury biomechanics in 96 to 2008. And Dr. Bass then joined Duke University, the Department of Biomedical Engineering, where currently he's a director of the Injury Biomechanics Laboratory. So he has many publications, 120 of them in this area of injury biomechanics, modeling, and soft tissue mechanics. So without much further ado, let's welcome Dr. Bass.
How are y'all this evening? How are you? You didn't answer. Good. So, this is a fascinating topic, and I believe I got $4,000 in funding for this thing, a whole $4,000. So clearly this is a very important thing for everybody in this world. 4,000 whole bucks doesn't go very far these days, but we were, I think, able to solve the mystery. And so it's been a mystery for a long time. The first mystery was where the hell it was, because it disappeared. The ship disappeared, the boat disappeared, and didn't find it till 2000. So it was an interesting start. So Civil War in the United States is still a little contentious, even 150 years later. And so I'm not clear why exactly. I'm from North Carolina, and I spent an awful lot of time in Virginia. So I have a disclaimer. And no. Those guys are hotheads. So almost all of my great-great-grandfathers fought for the Confederacy in Virginia and North Carolina. And North Carolina, if you say you're from North Carolina and they fought for something at this time period, this wasn't very good. In fact, in the Revolutionary War, North Carolinians were well known for firing and running. This was used to great effect, and it's one of the reasons we won the Revolution is because North Carolinians ran while the Virginians behind them didn't. So a mixed history, but nobody fought for the U.S. government, so that's my disclaimer. So all of them but one deserted. So you can decide which way you want to go with this. Some multiple times, and the one who didn't desert entered Confederate service at 41, and then had to get out because of dysentery, and then got back in when he was 43. So we don't necessarily think he was whatever. All right. So with those disclaimers, things to think about when you start a war. So we have 23 northern states. I'll call them various things. I'll call them the United States. I'll call them the Federals. We have 11 southern states. I'll call them the Confederacy. I'll call them the South. So if you look at people, the number of people in the North were 23 million. The number of people in the South were 9 million. The only problem with the number of people in the South is that 4 million of them were slaves. And so you really can't count on them to fight this particular war about this particular thing. So it was not really good, the odds here. In addition, the Federals, the North, had 92% of industrial production. So if you're going to fight an industrial war, and this was the first industrial war, you start out at a major disadvantage. At the beginning of the war and throughout the war, the Confederates had no ability to forge steel. They had no ability to make machine tools. So they couldn't even make the things that are needed to make guns. And mostly they cast things out of iron. And so Richmond, Virginia was a center of iron casting, one of the only places for industry in the entire South, which is one of the reasons they made it the capital. If you want a statistic that matters, New York City had greater industrial production than the entire South. So bad juju. Exports, so you can just buy guns, right? The South had cotton, and cotton was the largest export in the United States, and it was larger than all the other exports. So that was the thought, we'll just buy guns. The problem is, you can't buy guns if you can't get the cotton to market. So this will come up in just a minute, but it'll be a problem eventually. So existing military, the United States had a Navy, the Confederates didn't. So the Confederates eventually had sort of a navy, but they had stolen most of these boats from the United States. By the end of the war, the United States Navy was the most powerful littoral warfare capability on the planet. And so littoral warfare is coastal rivers, things that might be useful in getting your cotton to market. So the only thing that the South had that was good was this man's Robert E. Lee. I'm sure you all know who this person is. He was offered command of the U.S. Army as well before he became an advisor to the South. So he initially wasn't the commander of the Southern Armies. He became commander of the Southern Armies because the commander of the Northern Armies recognized his potential, and he was actually a fantastic tactical genius who ended up fighting for the South. So about 25% of the U.S. Army and Marines went south, and especially Virginia. Virginia had an enormous heritage of military, and so this is the one thing the South probably had. However, in the U.S. Navy, almost no engineering officers went over. So when you're trying to convert from a sailing Navy to a Navy with power and steam, and these are the people you wanted to keep as opposed to the senior officers that they lost that will eventually become Confederate Navy. So this was good for the North, actually, not good for the South. So it becomes obvious that if the U.S. government wanted to contest this, that the U.S. government was probably going to win, it might not be quick. So the worst assumption made in the South was that the North wasn't going to contest this war. The worst assumption is in the North is that most Southerners had more loyalty to the United States government than they did to their own state. Both of these were untrue, and it led to a very long war. So on November 6, 1860, a Republican, Abraham Lincoln, who I'm sure most of you know, was elected U.S. president. South Carolina immediately considered this a hostile act. The election of the president was a hostile act. And then seceded from the United States on December 20th. So the entire South considered the election of Abraham Lincoln a hostile act, but of course they couldn't do anything about it because there's 23 million Northerners and about 5 million Southerners. So on March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln is inaugurated president, and by this time everybody knew that things probably weren't going to go well. A lot of the states had already taken federal installations in their state. One in particular, Fort Sumter, was attacked on April 12th, starting the war. This didn't take very long. It took about 36 hours. There were 6,000 South Carolina soldiers and about 127 Federals. So this started the long process of losing. So the commander-in-chief of the Federal armies was from Virginia. And he didn't go to the South. he came up with a brilliant plan. He didn't think the war would he didn't think the war would be quick. He thought the war would be long and slow. And he was right. And what he said was, okay, well, look, they have no industrial capability. We have all the industrial capability. What we will do is we will strangle them. It started becoming called the Anaconda Plan. We will just blockade all their ports and divide the Confederacy in two along the Mississippi. Everybody made fun of him. That's the reason it ended up being called the Anaconda Plan, because it was simple. All you had to do was take a Northern Army, march into Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, and the Confederates would give up. Yeah, that didn't happen. It reminds me of World War I that happened later, and you're like, who thought this was going to be quick? So lots of people thought it was going to be quick, but the U.S. government, 40 ships clearly are not going to blockade every port along the coast. The federal government started building ships. The Confederate government started building ships too, but slowly and poorly, with facilities that eventually would be taken by the federal government. Okay, so by 1863, losing was progressing pretty rapidly. Lincoln had settled on a group of generals. His initial group of generals were more or less incompetent, because the group of generals that he would have used largely went to the south. By then, he had settled on a group that were competent, committed, brutal. You need to be brutal in a war like this. There was no way that you were going to get away with just, oh, well, okay, are you going to surrender? No, they weren't going to surrender. So on July 4th, Robert E. Lee was headed north to invade the North, to try and get them to quit. That failed in Gettysburg. On July 9th, the Federals cut the Confederacy in half by taking the whole Mississippi. So the ports of New Orleans, the ports of Mobile, Alabama, most of the ports along the periphery of the Confederacy had been taken. If you look at Charleston in particular, this is Charleston after the war, Charleston was shelled by the Federal Navy every night. And in fact, they got so used to it that in their diaries, like, well, yeah, Minnie died tonight. And we went to a picnic, and then Georgette died. So it was actually a compelling and very sad reading of some of the diaries of that time. The U.S. Navy had largely stopped trade by 1863, and the only ports that were really open by that time was Wilmington, North Carolina, which eventually the Federals crushed by firing thousands and thousands and thousands of shells into the shells and cannonballs into the forts that protected them, and finally took it in 1865. So what were the Confederates to do? They had no navy. Their navy basically had been crushed by the U.S. government, and if they had managed to buy some ships in Great Britain, which they were trying to do, but they didn't ship cotton to Britain, so they didn't have much things to buy with, what do we do? So those would have been crushed too because of the industrial capacity. So what do you do? Okay, you can come up with torpedoes. So they came up with torpedoes and mines. That was fantastic. It worked some, but some of them were man-powered, so there weren't a lot of people who wanted to go out and blow themselves up by blowing out one of the, suicide was not particularly one of the Southern characteristics. So somebody came up with a great idea, and the Federals had worked on this too, of a submarine. So the Federals didn't need a submarine because the Confederates didn't have anything to sink. So the HL Hunley, was developed out of a boiler. So 8 people in this thing, and it's about to size. You can see how small it is. It's 40 feet long, about 4 feet in diameter, and you'd think they were smaller people than we are, so no, they're big people. They were 6'2". They're big people in this thing. And in practice, they had had a couple of sinkings. So in practice, and this will come up in a minute, in a practice, one of them had fallen to the bottom and they had all died of asphyxia. They had died of hypercapnia, so too much carbon dioxide. So one of these killed Hunley, and that's the reason it's named after one of the guys. So on February 17th, 1864, the Hunley got close to the USS Housatonic, which was shelling the Charleston Harbor, and blew up part of it, and the Housatonic sank. The first kill of a submarine in warfare. And then, although eyewitness accounts suggest that the Hunley returned to harbor, it vanished. for 150 years. The Hunley was recovered by Clive Kuessler's group in about 2000, so the author Clive Kuessler. And so there's some mysteries. You can see, I'll show you a better picture of the hull in a minute, but the hull's it's not broken apart. It was in about 30 feet of water, so it wasn't very deep. And it was inexplicably seaward of the Housatonic. So we actually, it was surprising that in 1864 we have tidal charts. We know how fast the tide was. We know how fast the tide was moving in 1864. We could figure out what happened. But this is the position in Charleston Harbor. The Hunley's orientation during the attack is right here against the Housatonic, and the final Hunley position was seaward. So there was eyewitness accounts that the blue light that they were supposed to show that when they had a successful attack was lit, and thus it wouldn't be there. It would be somewhere here closer to the harbor. So that's the first critical mystery. The Hunley's hull is pretty well intact. There are sections here, this is in Charleston. There are sections here, this is later damage, we know. These are sections that have been removed, but the rest of it, pretty well intact. So they didn't physically damage their hull except perhaps in one place up here in the conning tower. So the conning tower has a hole in it. And there's a theory with that as well, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So physically, the hull looks much like it did, and we know that the torpedo on the Hunley was still attached to the spar when it went off. And we know this because pieces of it remain on the spar. So if it hadn't been attached, then the torpedo wouldn't have worked. What they were supposed to do is go up, put the torpedo on the torpedo's charge, put the torpedo on the Housatonic, and then pull away. Clearly they didn't do that because we have evidence that they didn't do that. So the way the Hunley worked during the attack was, it was like this. The charge was like this, 135 pounds of black powder, and the Housatonic was up here. So it's under the Housatonic's hull. It goes off, blows a hole in the Housatonic, and disables the ship, taking one ship out of about 30 in the harbor. Yeah. So, so there were apparently no attempts to escape. When we look at the bones in the hull, these are basically one set, another set, another set. So they're sitting at their stations cranking. 7 of them crank, and then we got a commander. So they're all basically sitting at their stations. Can you imagine if water is coming in from some hole, if they're just going to sit there and wait while they drown? No, they probably aren't going to do this. And we have evidence from the previous attempt where they died that they were all at the hatch and they were clawing their way out and their fingers were actually damaged. So they didn't sit there. There's nobody in this audience who would sit there and go, oh, look, the water's coming in. I wonder if I think I'm just going to drown. I don't think I'm going to find a way out. In fact, we have Lieutenant Dixon, who is the commander, at his station. And this is the circumstance his bones were in, and it's pretty obvious he's just sitting there. So he was responsible for the keel ballast weights that could be released to pop them up to the surface quickly, and he didn't do anything. So it's kind of mysterious, which is the reason we started looking into this. Clearly, this is not the central focus of anyone's academic research, but I had a student from the Navy. She needed a project. I said, well, figure out what happened in the Hunley. So this was something that she actually has taken to heart, and I'll shill her book in just a minute. Not my book, but her book. So some theories of the sinking. Suffocation, anoxia, so not enough oxygen. Lucky shot theory. Somebody hit that portal with a Civil War era gun, poked a hole that looks like that, and they all drowned. Concussion. So the Navy's theory was that the ship, the boat, hit all of the naval personnel in the head at the same time. They became knocked out all at the same time, thus no one would try and get out, and then they died that way. So, or something else. So there's a possibility there's something else. So let's talk about these quickly. So we have a paper where we looked at anoxia. So we were pretty sure it wasn't anoxia, first of all. I don't know. Anoxia is actually a very calm death. There were a couple of NASA people who died a couple of years ago, 25 years ago. They walked into a building full of nitrogen. There's no oxygen in the building. They died. They didn't even know they were in the building full of oxygen that had no oxygen in it. And so this is a problem. So NASA doesn't fill buildings with nitrogen anymore and just let people walk in. So, right. So, but what happens in a small vessel is carbon dioxide builds up far faster than oxygen goes down. And so when carbon dioxide builds up, so hypercapnia, you start feeling nervous, like you want to get out of this place. And in fact, we know this from a later ship accident. Really nervous. So there's no way you'd sit there just cranking this thing like this. No, you'd be nervous. You'd want to get out. You would absolutely want to get out, and you'd feel it like this is probably evolutionarily appropriate for us. Get in small spaces. Before we run out of oxygen, we become nervous and want to get the heck out of there. So there is an accident, the Thetis accident, where we know an awful lot about it, where it's agonizingly soul-crushing to sit there in carbon dioxide. They did experiments on people, and you just want to get out of this place. It's one of the things, unlike anoxia, which is incredibly peaceful. So we did a paper. We found out that carbon dioxide builds up far faster than oxygen goes away, especially in a space this small, even with the most conservative assumptions we could come up with, and so we got rid of the suffocation theory. We don't think this is true, and there's no evidence that they just sat there for this. Okay, so the lucky shot. So somebody may have hit the conning tower, and it broke open, and water came in. So we have some evidence that shots were fired. So they knew the Confederates had submarines. They knew the Confederates were working on submarines, so they were trying very hard to not be hit by submarines while they're shelling Charleston. They had a lot of spies. North had spies, South had spies. So we know something about this. So what we wanted to do was determine if a Civil War era gun could cause this kind of damage. So we took a Civil War era gun. We didn't have a Springfield like the North had. We'd had an infield. There's very little difference between these ballistically. And so we shot at various Civil War era cast and wrought iron. And if you shoot at cast and wrought iron, it actually looks more or less like this. This is a hole the size of a bullet. It's surprisingly common to have a hole which is the size of the bullet in big things. The big thing here was cast iron, and is fairly brittle, and so it would have actually broken a larger hole than the hole we saw. So we also, the US government's done some experiments on this, not particularly for this, but just to determine the behaviors of wrought and cast iron. They found more or less the same thing. If there was a hole, this conning tower was above the water or very near to the surface of the water, and it would not have caused this big hole. Even if it did cause this big hole, within the paper we did a reasonable job of determining how long it would take the water to get in there. So it takes about 10 minutes for the water to get in the hull. By this time, I guarantee you nobody's sitting there cranking again. So this is the essential part of the mystery, is that they're just sitting there. So why the hell are they just sitting there? All right, so a little more on this. There's some other evidence that they didn't move out into the harbor. So we know where they ended up, we know where they started, so we can figure out how long it took them to sink from the lucky shot theory, and they actually sink too fast. So we have ruled out the lucky shot theory as well, and we published this as well. Okay, so now concussion. So when they first told me this was their theory, I said, 8 people concussed at the same time, all of them knocked out by the side of the ship, when the side of the ship looks like it's perfectly fine. This never happened. But I was willing to think about this, and think about, okay, well, how could this possibly happen? But I didn't have to think about it long because they actually looked into it. They looked into it with a full-scale model. The US Navy actually did a full-scale model where they blew up 135 pounds of charge near exactly the same place, and they did a computational model. So they had crash test dummies in the thing, they had a computational model. And if you look, you might be able to convince yourselves, this is an image courtesy of one of our collaborators, and you might be able to convince yourself they're close enough that maybe if it moved grossly, this would be possible. However, the U.S. Navy found that this isn't possible. They can't all be knocked out at the same time, and in fact, they're barely the hull barely moves during the event. So, yeah, that didn't happen either. The other thing is all the skulls were found, and they were intact. There's no skull damage. So it's hard to imagine how you knock all of them out without getting some kind of skull damage. So we have gotten rid of that. So it must be something else, right? Right, it's got to be something else. Okay, I will show you something. Blast. All of you know something about blast because of the movies. Right, so all of you know something wrong about blast. This is beautiful. This is just beautiful, and the thing falls over. Thankfully, it didn't hit anybody. So this is a real blast. This is 5 kilograms of composition 4. And that's a dummy. The dummy weighs 185 pounds, and the dummy would be knocked over if I went and pushed it over. So it weighs what a human does. You can see the blast. You can see the initial charge go off. That's the charge going off. The blast wave passes him, and then the fireball comes up. If this were a person, and he were just standing there in that open field blast, there is a 99% probability that he would be dead of pulmonary injuries. Right. You don't need to push him at all to die of blast injuries. So in the movie, if they had been thrown that far, they would have been dead. So in this case, you need to get away from the assumption that blast needs to push you anywhere. In fact, it's the interaction of your torso and the blast wave that causes this injury. So once again, no movement necessary for blast. So blast-induced traumatic brain injury, about the same thing. You can get blast-induced traumatic brain injury simply from the wave passing across your skull into your brain. Blast trauma in the pulmonary system looks like this. Lungs, these are clear. If you start to see white stuff, that's bad, that's blood. So you can die of blast injuries very quickly if the blast levels are high enough and you don't have to be pushed anywhere. So one of the hypotheses has to do with blast transmission. So blast can transmit across a structure. You can have a shock come in, hit a structure, pass through the structure, and on the other end of the structure, it also shocks. So that was our hypothesis. Our hypothesis is that water transmitted the shock to the hull, and water transmits shock enormously efficiently. Rachel, my student, has a paper that shows that water-induced blast injury, if you're in the water, I mean, these guys aren't in the water, but if you're in the water, you can die of charges of this size 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers away. So you don't want to be in when the charge goes off, you want to be out of the water. Try to jump out of the water. So I want to emphasize the crew weren't underwater, they're actually in the air. There are vessels in the water, but so we have to figure out exactly how this happened, that it was transmitted to the structure and then through the structure and shocked into the air. We have a paper on underwater blast. One interesting clue is that the commander, Lieutenant Dixon's watch looks like this. And I don't know how easy it is to see, but the crystal is cracked. And it isn't cracked from being under 30 feet of water. It's cracked from something that cracked it. So we know that the vessel is more or less intact, yet the watch is cracked. So that gives us an idea that it might have actually something to do with air blast. So what we did was we had $4,000, and for $4,000 I can't make a whole Hunley. I can only make a part of a Hunley or a little Hunley. So, so this is a scale model of the Hunley that was made by one of our collaborators in Durham that Rachel calls the CSS Tiny. And we went out to Farmer Pitt's pond, because not everybody will let you blow things up. And the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, any y'all Americans? So the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is the people who keep you from blowing things up. And they collaborated with us and actually blew things up for us. So it was quite nice. We had a scaled test. We were about 6 scaled. We knew what the charge size was. This is actually very well known. And we also had some idea from the Navy tests what, although they weren't collaborating with us, and I'll talk about this in a minute. We had some idea of what the charge magnitude would be. So we looked to see, first of all, if you could actually transmit through these vessel walls. And it turns out that this is what it looks like in the water. And we do get transmission through the hull. So this was quite nice. And short duration transmission, this is about 1 millisecond. So 1,000th of a second. So this is necessary for blast injuries. These really short duration peaks from these transmissions that go to the hull. So we did a bunch of scale blast tests. Duke actually allowed us to do we were allowed to do something in the pond, but we weren't allowed to do explosives. So we did what is called shock tube tests in the pond. So I was surprised that Duke let us do this. Farmer Pitt, yeah. The farmer loved this. I mean, they sat out around the pond and watched the things blow up. It was actually really cool. I did the same thing. So we did this with plates too and found out that you could get substantial transmission behind the plates, and we quantified how much transmission you could get behind the plates. So at the Hunley magnitude of 135 pounds of black powder, we could get about 8.4% of the peak transmitted. That's a fair amount when you're talking about something that you haven't backed off of. So they would have had no idea about this. We didn't know anything about blast propagation, blast wave transmission until the 40s. So this is quite a bit after their time. So if we look with the most conservative assumptions we can make, so I'm a blast biomechanist. This has now propagated into the air in the Hunley with the most conservative assumptions we can make, and I can compare with my injury risk values. So the amount of TNT that this is equivalent to is here, and the amount of transmission is here, so we don't quite know exactly how much is transmitted, and a whole bunch of other assumptions. But given a whole bunch of other assumptions, all of which are conservative, we're at about 90% risk of dying of pulmonary blast injuries inside the hull of the Hunley. And I'll tell you, so these are Rachel's estimates, and I'll tell you mine in just a minute. And the risk of pulmonary injury is well over 100%. So all of them were definitively injured. These are incredibly conservative assumptions that she had made. In addition, we looked at brain injury. So I have curves also for brain injury, and we're at about, for her assumptions, we're at about 35% risk of brain injury, brain fatality from this blast inside this hull. However, some of the technical issues that Rachel and I talked about, and I let her have the conservative assumptions, but this is a three-dimensional object underwater, and it's basically being focused, the charge is being focused at it, and everything coming from the walls is coming at the people inside, and there's reverberations inside which we haven't accounted for. So all of these other effects, I have a different estimate. My estimate's actually somewhere above 99% risk. So, we have a dispute, but both these disputes lead us to this conclusion. So there's a bunch of other submarines, right? And they've been associated with blast in other conflicts, especially World War II. Wonder what the hell happened there, because those people weren't dying of blast. Can I say hell? So if we look at World War II, their hulls are much thicker. Now we have double hulls, nothing would get through. Their hulls are thicker, and they're not made of wrought iron, they're made of steel. And so steel only transmits 0.18. So they would not have died of blast injuries, and they wouldn't have holed the hull. So we convinced ourselves, okay, well, we didn't see this in other places, and here's why. Much better metallurgy, much better. So if we just look at this, the worst you can get is about 145 dB. 145 dB causes your ears to ring for a few seconds, and that's probably okay. So we feel quite good about this. So I mentioned there was a signal from the Hunley, right? So somebody saw this, and the people in Charleston who now are the caretakers for the Hunley say, oh, well, there was a signal, so what you say can't be true. The signal that was agreed upon, the Hunley ended up, the wreck of the Housatonic is here, and the signal was supposed to be seen here by Lieutenant Colonel Dantzler. This is 6 miles away in Charleston Harbor. So that was an eyewitness report that the blue signal was seen. Here are some other eyewitness reports from the Navy inquest. It came in at right angles to the heel, pointed amidships. It also came in at 45 degrees with the heel coming from the forward. It also approached the starboard bow obliquely to the heel. Well, now all those can't be true. And in fact, no two of those can be true. In addition, eyewitness reports reported the Hunley coming back to harbor. Well, that can't be true. We found it in 2000 underneath, so this obviously isn't true. So our theory about the blue light is we sent somebody out to take a picture of what the moon would look like at the right phase over Charleston Harbor during this time. The moon looks like this. Huh. Yeah. So it was suggestive, and we really appreciate this. We really appreciate this. So in addition, Dantzler had other people with him. And Dantzler's people said, we had a signal. We didn't see anything, so we didn't light a return fire. We didn't light a return signal. So, So from us, what killed the Hunley? So blast from the charge that sank the Housatonic transmitted efficiently through the water into the hull, into the air inside the HL Hunley, causing air blast injuries to the lung and crew that immediately incapacitated the crew. And thus, they weren't going anywhere. When it sank going into that hull, it sank at exactly the right rate that it ended up at the place that it was. So we feel quite good about this. We have a number of publications that I will leave here. In the aftermath, we received worldwide press coverage on this. In fact, this is the Sunday Times, and my mother doesn't quite know what I do. But she does know the Sunday Times. If I get an article published in Nature, she won't do Sunday Times, that's fantastic. And the reaction from the friends of the Hunley, the people who continue to be the caretakers for the Hunley, I'm happy to discuss this in the QA. So before we do the QA, I would like to relentlessly shill my student's book, which is a Dutton Press book. She's going to talk about the whole process. It's fascinating, the technical details and also the personal details. She's been to the archives so many times that I had to tell her to stop going to the archives and actually start doing her dissertation. She spent days, she got a fellowship to go to the, who knew this even existed? There's a black powder archives. She got a fellowship to go there. I don't think anybody else has ever gone there. She stayed on site and actually went in there. So she did a great job of this dissertation, and she got an agent and a publisher, and now has a book coming out from Random House Dutton in 2020. Thank you.
That's a fantastic story. Oh, very exciting. This is the first time I heard this lecture as well.
It's the first time I've heard it too.
Right. So I'd like to open the for questions. Please, we have time. 10-15 minutes. Yes, please. Go.
You mentioned that you were going to discuss the Navy's response to this finding.
So I've never, I'm an academic. I have a Duke University, so it isn't a community college somewhere if we want to be snotty about it. And so we wandered down to Charleston, Rachel and I did. Rachel's from the Navy, so she actually works with the Navy. And we said, the people in Charleston who keep the Housatonic are largely archaeologists. So I don't quite understand what they do. I mean, they're deconcreting the hull, right? So they're spending an awful lot of time chipping rust off. I'm not sure why one would do this, but they want to do this. So we wandered down. They hadn't solved it, and they were working with some other Navy people. And we wandered down, and I said, would y'all like to collaborate? I have never in my life gotten a quicker no. So they didn't want to collaborate. That's okay, they don't have to collaborate with me. But we kept talking, and they allowed that we could do the Anoxia hypoxia part of it, which we were already almost done with, so I was like, oh, that's great. And then it was about 2 months later, they came back to Rachel, and they said, we need you to sign a non-disclosure agreement. You're like, you didn't disclose anything, so there's nothing. So they're the Civil War continues to be fought in South Carolina. I say this as a North Carolinian. And so when the Hunley was raised, everybody wanted this. I don't know why I didn't go to the Smithsonian. It's property of the U.S. Navy. It is literally property of the U.S. Navy. And so there were a bunch of sites who wanted to have it, including the current site where it is. They don't really have much of a museum. They haven't done this very well. And so there were $10 million, $20 million offers. Those offers have all disappeared. The climate is quite different now. So they didn't want somebody else to solve the problem, even if it was with them. And they thought they had part of the Navy that did blast biomechanics. But just a little secret, the Navy doesn't do blast biomechanics. I do blast biomechanics. So they were great with structures, but they didn't even think of this. They didn't think that this might be the solution. Their first thought was crash test dummies in the hull. But we knew the hull probably didn't hurt them because the hull wasn't damaged. To move the hull enough to hurt them probably requires that the hull be damaged. So that wasn't happening. So they are extraordinarily unhappy. So we put a paper out in PLOS One. So PLOS One's an open access journal now, which is a great paper, which got worldwide coverage, right? I mentioned this. So they sent a geologist out after us, because PLOS One has comments, right? They sent a geologist out after us, and his first comment was, I don't really know these people. That's not particularly surprising. I don't know you either. So then they actually give tours, and if you ask them about this, because Rachel was on one of the tours, and her father was also on one of the tours, and his father asked repeatedly leading questions about this. And I've heard other people say this, but now they call her the girl. This is a 32-year-old woman. And they say, the girl stole data from the Navy and blah, blah, blah. So they really aren't happy about this. So yes, and so there's a bunch of Navy. The United States has got a lot of Navy. So I work for the Navy, a lot. And so this place I'd never heard of, the Naval Historical Command, basically put out a note that said, well, it hasn't been solved yet, which is fine. That's something okay for them to say, but they're the Naval Historical Command. They have no way of determining whether it's been solved yet. So they still remained unhappy. And so right before I was coming over, they put out a press release that they have solved the mystery. So this is in the Daily Mail if you want to go look at it, the British tabloid. My son thinks I shouldn't read the Daily Mail because it's a British tabloid. It's one of the fastest sources of news ever because they pay for their stories, unlike American outlets do. So I'm going to be in trouble for that later. So they've solved this, and the solution was that I mentioned there were keel weights that the commander could release, and they could pop up on it. And the solution was they hadn't released the keel weights. So as Rachel said, basically they said, oh well, we could save ourselves, but we're not going to. So that's not a particularly good solution, or at least not a particularly rational one. So most of the Navy, the people who actually do blast structures are like, yeah, that's probably it. So some of the Navy is not happy with us. But they're the Historical Command. I don't know that I've ever gotten any funding from them. That was the longest answer I've ever given in my life.
Okay, here's an opportunity for a short one. What did cause the hole in the tower?
We don't know. So there's the hole in the body is clearly like an anchor going through long after, because the evidence was that it was on top of a bunch of accretions. So part of our difficulty with this is that the Friends of the Hunley didn't collaborate with us. So there was an autopsy done, but they haven't published it 18 years later. The bodies have been reburied. So we've tried everything we know to get the autopsy information. And I think that would tell us an awful lot. When we have seen on a National Geographic special, this is what we have to go get down to. We've seen on a National Geographic special MRIs of the brains. So the brains are intact. They've been at the bottom of a harbor for a long time in cold, And they showed a surface of the brain which appears to us to be aged blood. So it's quite likely that they died of neurotrauma as well. If they died of neurotrauma, they definitely died of pulmonary trauma. So we don't know. I think we could get more answers if Hunley would collaborate.
Thank you. So after the explosion, the hull was intact, the crew was incapacitated.
Yep.
Did the Hunley rely on propulsion to maintain buoyancy as a modern submarine does? Like, what caused it to actually drift and then sink?
So what we think, so again, this is speculative. So it did to a certain extent, but there were planes that kept them buoyant. What we think happened was that hole, if it existed, caused them to sink. If it didn't exist, then what happened was they eventually turned enough that they started getting water in through the conning tower. So we don't really know. I think this is a question of, but we know how long, roughly how long it took, because they had to go from the surface down to the bottom in 310 meters. So we know that constrains the amount of time it could have taken. So we just don't know.
I'm not sure I've misunderstood, but you said that Hunley himself died on one of these submarines.
Yeah.
So how many were there? And also, what does HL stand for?
I have no idea. That's a quick answer. I don't know. There were 3 versions. There were a lot of versions because, obviously you don't have any submarines. So you have to figure out how to do buoyancy. You have to figure out how to do all these things. But I think there were 3 major versions, and 2 of them sunk. And so one of them sunk in such a way they were able to get out. And then one of them sunk in such a way that all of them died. So, and in fact, Dixon was the commander because he thought the project was going too slowly. Once a bunch of people died, they started taking their time and taking care. But, the sad thing, at least from my political point of view, is that this was a lost cause from the second they started, right? And so by 1864, there's one harbor open, and it's not the harbor that you're trying to defend. So so. Lawson.
All right, thank you.
My son came up with the HL.
Thank you for the presentation. Yes, I have a question about the theory behind the shock wave that you presented. Basically, you assume that you do some of the tests actually to prove the theory that actually the shock wave that come from the water. Yeah. And in one of the slides that you showed the picture of the Hunley that is approaching the ship and basically detonated the C4 at a certain distance. And then how?
It's black powder. It's not C4.
Okay.
It's not a modern explosive. It's black powder.
Yeah, so basically that explosive was detonated under the water or on the hull of the frigate. Yeah.
So ships of the time, you are protecting down to the waterline. Otherwise you'll get holes. So below the waterline, not as much protection. So this is well below the waterline, and so they're trying to get up under the hull far enough that the cladding or whatever's on the ship at this point doesn't protect you. So this is well below the surface. They were basically on the surface. And so they were just under the surface so you couldn't see them coming, but they were basically on the surface.
Yeah, the second row first and sorry.
Just to put a scale on that, assuming that the conning tower is at surface level, the charge, how much below the conning tower is it?
I used to know these numbers exactly, but I think it's 12 feet. Yeah, so this is 40 feet. This is about 4 feet, a little more than 4 feet. Yeah. So not far enough to go under the ship, but far enough to hit the ship at the not particularly on the keel, but under the ship.
Given that the technology was so primitive and the likelihood of a successful outcome was fairly small, can we safely assume that Lieutenant Dixon was not a North Carolinian? But my question is, did they actually do any testing beforehand?
They did. They did extensive testing, which led to them, which led to one of the crews dying. So the testing was slower and slower because this is a complicated task and not necessarily for the Federals. If the Federals had wanted to do this, they probably could have done it fairly quickly because they had lots of money, they had industrial capabilities. But this move from Mobile, so Mobile was taken. This move from Mobile to Charleston, the problem the Confederates had is that every time they get a ship or a shipyard, the Federals would come and take it because they knew that the fewer ships and shipyards that they had, the better it would be for the Federals. It's one of the myths of the war that all these land battles, the land battles were important, but the sea battles actually choked the South. No matter how much military spirit you have, if you don't have any guns and you don't have anything to pay your people or feed them, it's really a problem. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. That was fantastic. I don't know if this is a bit of a rude question.
Rude questions, I love rude questions.
The people who donated the $4,000 to you, were they happy with your result?
Yeah, they were, and I'll tell you who these people are. So the Dukes, this is tobacco money. The Duke University is Duke University because at one point the Dukes owned the largest tobacco company in the world. Like Standard Oil, John Rockefeller's Standard Oil, it was broken up in trust by the U.S. government, and so they're rich. So they founded a university, and the successors of the Dukes, the Trents, who also I think are well off, they have a fund and they do historical medical things. And so I've gotten funding to do World War I investigations of blast and post-traumatic stress disorder, and I've also gotten fundings for this. They love this. They think this was fantastic. In fact, I think they love the conflict between us and the Friends of the Hunley even more than they love us having solved it. So, these are very low stakes. My career doesn't rely on this.
So given obviously submarine development happened after this, have you found any corroborating evidence from other developments of submarine that this blast is in fact a problem or could have been a problem in early submarines?
So the Navy is concerned about this right now because of the possibility. But so the difference between later submarines and these submarines is this is a wrought iron boiler. That's what started it. So forged steel, that's what happened later. And so forged steel is far more protective and stiffer than wrought iron. And so the era in which wrought iron boilers were used as submarines is there. And so, right. So we actually were concerned about this ourselves because we're going, there's a lot of depth charges and things, but it's the difference between steel and wrought iron.
One more last question.
Yes, so when that then begs the question that when historically did they make that shift from cast iron to steel, and in submarine warfare, or by the time you had extensive submarine warfare, that already shifted them?
Yeah, so the Confederates would have used steel as well if they could have made it, which they couldn't. So as I mentioned, there were no places to forge steel in the South. So you need to consider this when you start warfare. Submarine warfare has largely been nations that didn't have powerful navies. So the UK doesn't have a great submarine tradition of ancient because they had an incredibly powerful navy. Submarines are by people who want to sink the incredibly powerful navy, like the Germans and the Germans. So So this is most of where we get submarine warfare from. We actually, the United States has spent an awful lot of money and time in submarines, but to make other navies less powerful, ours remains the most powerful.
Well, we reached the 7 o'clock. So it's been a fantastic audience. and of course, fantastic talk by Dr. Bass. So, University of Melbourne should would like to show the
Yeah, in addition, so I've been here for a month. I was, in addition to taking me for a month, that's fantastic.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I appreciate the opportunity.